A survey of a bunch of Chicago Bears fans found some cautious optimism about Justin Fields, a lot more concern about the players around him, and not a lot of faith in how the team as a whole will do this season.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. On the show today, we go through a fan survey conducted by The Athletic. They got, I think, a couple thousand Bears fans to respond, asking a wide range of questions about this team. And we'll go through some of the most interesting and notable answers from that work. A great job by Kevin Fishbane over there. And really, all the guys at The Athletic do a great job. But we'll talk about the confidence level in Justin Fields, a couple of different questions, slicing and dicing that in a few different ways. We'll look at the offensive personnel, where the concern is strongest, and also where the concern is the lowest, where the least concern. Same thing for public opinion on offensive coordinator Luke Getsy. Then we'll turn our attention to the biggest impact free agents, where the fan base sees the win total this season, and kind of where the fan favorite players are, and a name noticeably missing from those results as well. But let's start with Justin Fields, the man of the offseason, the man of the franchise right now for your Chicago Bears. And I think that's where I was most interested to start to see, like, okay, after an up and down rookie season, after so much excitement following the draft pick, the trade up, I mean, he was the savior brought in. It still is the savior, but even that way I characterize it seems to be, reflected that pause in there. He still is, but, there's sort of a but there. There's the shimmer has come off just a little bit. Most of us are ready to kind of look past the rookie season and say, yeah, it wasn't perfect and wasn't great in a lot of moments, but not really his fault at a lot of that time, and still all the confidence in the world that he can continue to grow and be that potential franchise quarterback. But the survey from The Athletic had the respondents give Justin Fields a rating on a scale of 1 to 5 on how confident are you specifically that Justin Fields will be a star. And the majority at 39.7%, or I guess that's considered a plurality, was giving him a 4 out of 5 stars of confidence. 4 out of 5 confident that Justin Fields will be a star. And then the second most came at 3. So most fans were either a 4 or a 3 out of 5 in their level of confidence that Justin Fields would be a star. Just about 10% had full 5 out of 5. Just about 10%, or just over 10%, had 2 out of 5, and then a very, very small majority has apparently given up or whatever on a 1 out of 5. So what's interesting about this is, yes, obviously still a high level of confidence in Justin Fields after that rookie season. That's not necessarily, surprising. It wasn't as though Bears fans, or there was any feeling among Bears fans that everyone was already done with Fields after one season, or just, ready to give up, or lost all that confidence just after those games that we saw in a pretty bad situation all around. But it's interesting how there has been a drop down from last year. A year ago, when they did this same survey, they asked the same question about Justin Fields, and you can see that overall fan level of confidence in Fields declining. So last year, that 4 out of 5 rating was at 52.9%, essentially 53% rated at a 4, which went down to 39% this year. So, almost, or a little over 10, 13% there down at that 4 rating. And also the 5 out of 5 confidence rating went from 23 to 10. So more than cut in half the highest confidence in Fields on that end. And that wasn't even immediately after draft night. That was after OTAs and a little bit. So it wasn't just like the hype of the moment, but a little bit more of the off-season progress from that point, and some OTAs and mini camp reports from there. But you can see how then, as a result, the 3s and 2s are a little bit higher on the confidence scales, and the 4s and 5s are a little bit lower. And I'm guessing the 1 out of 5 is also even a little bit higher as well. So the confidence level there is something I'm curious to kind of see how that portrays like throughout the season and how it ends up sort of playing out. Because the other question they asked to kind of follow up on that, the question for the fans was, how does your confidence in Justin Fields' potential compare with how you felt at this time last year? In that answer, 45% of people said the same. That was the strongest answer. And then 29% are more confident, 25% are less confident. So nearly as many fans are less confident in him now as there are who are more confident in him. So it seems like there's this split, right? That some people are seeing some growth and potential and feel like he showed enough flashes last year to have more of that confidence. And a similar number of people are concerned enough about that mistake, sort of, not fully his fault season, but still a bad set of circumstances for him and poor results generally to bring that down. Still, 45.5%, nearly half and nearly a majority, but definitely a plurality have the same level of confidence in Fields. So it's not like everything drastically shook up, but out of that, more than half of the people changed their level of confidence in Fields based on last season, and that was split about halfway between more and less confidence. So there's a spectrum here, and I'm kind of curious, what kind of leash he has and what kind of patience will remain for Justin Fields. I think everyone is still hoping. It's just, even if the confidence level is down, Bears fans are always still hoping that he can be very good, and there's still plenty of reason to think he can be very good. And most Bears fans seem to be still leaning in that confidence, but more confident than not in Fields' ability here, which to me seems to be reasonable and about where it is. But it's interesting to kind of get that majority opinion to see the full pulse of the fan base on the young quarterback. The confidence level seems to be much lower when it comes to some of the rest of the roster and the offense in particular around Justin Fields. We'll kind of get into a few more of these poll results on Luke Getsy, on the offensive line, on the quarterback position as a whole as well, before the win total and some other guys that are notables on this roster. Next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by the world's best tasting protein bars ever made. They're called Built Bars, and they truly feel like a cheat code when it comes to having that delicious sweet treat to satisfy your sweet tooth, and it also still being good for you. Because Built Bars taste like candy bars. They're all soft, they're easy to chew, they're covered in 100% real chocolate, but they're also low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It's the best of both worlds. I'm in love right now with the coconut brownie chunk Built Puff that they have out right now. It's got actual pieces of brownie embedded in them in like a coconutty marshmallow in the middle. Ugh, unbelievable. You cannot beat it anywhere else. You got to try them for yourself. Head over to built.com. Enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Confidence remains high in Justin Fields, but confidence seems to be a bit lower in some of the guys around him. And it isn't necessarily surprising where it is, but still, The Athletic asked Bears fans what position concerns you the most on this Bears team, and a whopping 64.5% said offensive line. We just broke down the offensive line earlier this week on the podcast as part of our training camp previews. Some very real and obvious questions and concerns at right guard, and then still competitions to be shaking out at both offensive tackle spots, with Larry Borum and Tevin Jenkins and perhaps the rookie Braxton Jones all being in the mix at that spot. I was a little bit surprised that the offensive line took such a vast majority at 64.5%. I mean, it was open up to every position on the roster, offense and defense, and offensive line was almost 2/3 of the vote. Of course, you would expect then that, as it was, wide receiver came in second, but wide receiver was only at 24.4%. So basically like 1/4 of the people said wide receiver and nearly 2/3 said offensive line. And I thought perhaps that those numbers might be closer together. Doesn't surprise me that offensive line was number one, but to have 40% more say offensive line than wide receiver out of this group of 2,000, maybe the N'Keal Harry trade happening before this was enough of a spring, or maybe between having Darnell Mooney and maybe some confidence in Byron Pringle and Velus Jones, they did use the earlier draft pick at wide receiver as opposed to the offensive line. But still, 4 draft picks on the third day of the draft is not nothing on that O-line. The other thing that stood out to me about this one and the sort of reverse question was the positions that came in third. So this one was which position concerned you most. Offensive line was won by a lot. Number 2 was wide receiver. Number 3 was quarterback at 6%. So 65%, 25%, 6%. Quarterback was the third most voted on position as being the most concerning. And then from there, it's all like 0 and 1% for defensive line, cornerback, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you go to what position concerns you the least, quarterback was also third there at 9.4%. The position that concerned Bears fans the least in this was running back at 61%. That one doesn't surprise me all that much. Although similarly, linebacker came in second, and I thought maybe those would be closer given the fan support of Roquan Smith and the general seeming acceptance of Nick Morrow, the free agent addition, as being, a sure thing. That feels like the perception, right? Is that there's a confidence level in him being a sure thing next to Roquan Smith. Maybe not a Pro Bowler, but at least you know what you're getting from him. And so I thought the linebacker confidence might be higher than 10% compared to running back at 61%. But then quarterback at 9.4% as position concerning you the least, compared to 6.1% of position concerning you the most. It's weird that the same position, which really we're talking about basically one player. I mean, because if Fields gets hurt, then you're screwed either way. So basically the same player has some percentage of fans thinking it's the least concerning position on the roster, and some percentage of fans thinking it's the most concerning position on the roster. And I think that's interesting to pair with the results that we just talked about, where, for some fans, they're about an equal amount are more confident in Fields than they were last year, than they are less confident in Fields than last year. And so it's a similar place. It's not quite the exact same percentage, 9.4 to 6.1, but a similar range of percentages also is either most concerned about quarterback or least concerned about quarterback in this poll by The Athletic. Otherwise, I think, running back, Montgomery, Herbert, you're pretty set there. Linebacker, you got Roquan, and we're fairly confident in Nick Morrow, just maybe some depth concerns at that spot. The other positions that are concerned the least included cornerback, safety, and special teams, all at 4% or higher on that mix. Even a couple of people voted offensive line as position that concerns you the least. A couple people voted wide receiver as well as position that concerns you the least. So you're always going to have, both sides of the spectrum. There's always a little bit of a margin of error that you can sort of field in there, but you can see okay, confidence is low in offensive line and wide receiver. Confidence is high in running back and pretty high in linebacker as well. But that brings to another question about the offensive coordinator then, not just the players on offense, but the actual coach calling the plays and setting the scheme. And the question for that one just was, what are your expectations for Luke Getsy, the offensive coordinator? And you got 3 options to choose from. On the top of the spectrum, he'll be the difference maker for Fields and the offense and earn a head coaching position. Then in the middle, you have the personnel isn't good enough. Does it matter? ? And then at the bottom, you have nervous about a first-time play caller. And the majority of Bears fans said the personnel isn't good enough. Does it matter? At 53.5%. And then the other 2 options were exactly tied. Nervous about a first-time play caller, and he'll be the difference maker for Fields. So much like the discussion on Fields, where majority of the fans were kind of in the middle, and then an equal amount were split on the high and the low, that seems to be the same case for Luke Getsy. 53 say, the personnel isn't good enough, so it doesn't matter for Luke Getsy. And then an equal amount are nervous about him, and an equal amount also then thinks he could be a difference maker. But the interesting point here that Kevin Fishbane pointed out was that it's nice that it kind of gives Getsy a pass either way here, because if then the offense struggles this season, we'll kind of blame the personnel. I think understandably, I would lean that way too, of if the offensive line is bad and the receivers are bad or whatever, then we're not really going to blame Luke Getsy for not being a very good coordinator. But, if the offense does perform well and the line comes together nicely and receivers are making plays for Justin Fields, we're also going to give Luke Getsy, I'm sure, a lot of the credit for the scheme there. So it does seem like a little bit of a no-lose public opinion spot on Getsy right now, where it's there's enough concerns from Bears fans about the personnel that he's not going to get blamed for it. So then he can only get credit for it if it goes well. So I just thought that's a nice a nice summation of sort of where this fan base seems to really be on this offensive coordinator and this offense outside of Justin Fields, which already has the beginnings of polarizing. I don't think he's going to get to like, Jay Cutler level of polarizing, although Mitch Trubisky eventually got to be a very polarizing Bears quarterback. So you never know. But I think, at least on this podcast, we have still more confidence that Fields is going to be able to overcome this situation, even if it's not immediately this season being a dominant quarterback just yet, but feels like he has the talent and the natural ability to eventually still develop into a potential franchise quarterback. Maybe not a top 5 quarterback, but a potential franchise quarterback that can, be a difference maker in some of these games. All that confidence kind of boils down to then, or all that split confidence sort of boils down to, moderate expectations for this Bears team from fans in this survey. We'll kind of get into where they see the win total this season, plus some interesting public opinion on the favorite Bears players in particular, and a guy who didn't really get nearly as much as I thought he might have, next on Locked On Bears. Given a mixed bag of confidence about Fields, or I guess high confidence, but cautious optimism about Fields. How about we'll call it that? Cautious optimism about Fields, some questions and concerns about the team around him a little bit more. Where would you think Bears fans would predict the win total for this team? Because I think a lot of times fan bases tend to, come into the season optimistic whenever possible and try and predict that the team may win more games than they actually will, because you hope for the team to win as many games as possible. And so that might not skew your prediction, but bias your prediction, as opposed to, are you trying to be the most accurate at guess correctly, or guess kind of closer to what you might want to see on how many wins the Bears will have. And I sort of get the impression, anecdotally, ignoring the survey results for a second, anecdotally from Bears fans that, shooting for that 500 or maybe, I've heard some Bears fans talk about, if things can come together with these wide receivers and offensive line, that they could be a sneaky team to push, maybe for that 7th playoff spot, or at least be in the mix towards the end of the season. I've always fallen a little bit more on the other side of that and a little bit less hopeful for this season specifically. And I was a little bit surprised to see how not necessarily specifically unanimous on one win or one specific win total that Bears fans were in the survey, but just that nearly 97% expected the Bears to finish below 500 this season. So almost an equal tie between predicting 6 wins and 5 wins in this upcoming season. And then, a little bit less predict 7, and then 4 fewer is beyond that. So just under 29% said 6 wins this season for the Bears. That was the vote winner in the poll. And then about 1% less said 5 wins. And then about 7% less, down at 20%, said 7 wins. So that 5 to 7 win range is where, over 70% of the vote from Bears fans sit, with over 50% in the 6 or 5 range. And I think the betting total right now at BetOnline is over under 6.5 wins, I think is where it is for the Bears. And so both of those, over 50% of Bears fans are thinking that would then be the under on the win total this season. And that was a little surprising to me, just because of that sort of optimism bias, we'll call it, that I might have otherwise expected from Bears fans. And I do think this is a fan base that has been tortured and, traumatized a little bit over the years, having optimism for this team and being disappointed by it fairly regularly, especially in recent seasons, not named 2018. So maybe that's just sort of, bringing the level of hope and optimism back down. But I thought still, like, new regime, new head coach. Not that I thought the poll would have Bears fans saying 12 wins and a Super Bowl or anything, but I just thought I thought the number would be high. Would have a lot more people saying 8, 9 wins, and those were both below 10% of the fans said 8 or 9 or more wins. Like 12.5 said 4 or fewer. So like it's definitely skewing on that lower end, and I was again surprised that despite there still being some good optimism in Justin Fields, less optimism in the offensive personnel around him. That's not translating to a significant number in terms of win total. The other answer that surprised me a bit was one that I wouldn't have thought to ask, but then the answer, I was glad they asked based on what the answer was. It was, other than Justin Fields, if you were going to buy a current Bears jersey, who would you pick? I wasn't surprised that Roquan Smith was the winner there at 40.2%. Darnell Mooney right behind him at 20%. David Montgomery in third at 13%. And then Jaquan Brisker at fourth. The rookie safety at 8.3% was a little bit of a surprise for me there. But all the way at the bottom of the voting was Eddie Jackson. And I would have thought Eddie Jackson would have been higher. I didn't think Eddie Jackson would be number one, maybe not even number two, because Darnell Mooney in fantasy football, and he's a young, exciting player and all that. Like, I get the question is not who is your favorite Bears player, but who would you buy a jersey of? And so the jersey purchasing equation involved, you're thinking, okay, how young is this player? How long will they be on the team? Could they be one of the team's all-time greats? How long will this jersey be important and valuable to me? And so I understand then Eddie Jackson being, on the older side of the Bears roster, not that he's an old player, but just one of the more experienced, longer tenured Chicago Bears. And I get too that there's some real uncertainty perhaps about how long he's going to stay a Bear given the size of his contract and the performances that we've seen. But I've always gotten the impression that there's a contingency of Bears fans who are still really have a lot of faith in Eddie Jackson, that holding on to the 2018 season and some of the stuff we saw younger in his career, and now with a new defense, maybe that this can be to get you back to Eddie Jackson. And so I thought, like I said, I didn't think Eddie Jackson would be at the top of the list, but 0.5%. More people voted that they would buy a Cairo Santos jersey than Eddie Jackson. Here's a list of players above Eddie Jackson: Cairo Santos, Velus Jones, Kyler Gordon, Jalen Johnson, Cole Kmet, Jaquan Brisker, David Montgomery, Darnell Mooney, Roquan Smith. So, right, it's not like people were picking, backup offensive linemen or, the kick, or they literally did pick the kicker, but not like the rookie punter or whatever. But yeah, they picked the kicker, a jersey for the kicker, Cairo Santos, over getting an Eddie Jackson jersey. I just feel like there were already quite a few Eddie Jackson jerseys out there. I guess a lot of them still say 39 instead of 4, but still 0.5% for Eddie Jackson. Just a real surprise to me. But again, no surprise for Roquan Smith, Darnell Mooney, David Montgomery at the top, because Justin Fields, again, it's a jersey not named Justin Fields, because it's sort of the assumption automatically that Fields would be the overwhelming favorite there for Bears fans to purchase. Not really much love for Robert Quinn. He's probably going to get traded too at some point here. So, the list of names starts to get narrowed down there pretty quickly after the rookies too. And Eddie Jackson just ends up at the bottom of the list. Maybe the public opinion on him is not as high as I thought it might have. And I think perhaps rightfully so. There was a lot to criticize of his performance over the last couple of seasons, specifically compared to his salary. But it's not as though he's been a bad NFL safety. He just hasn't necessarily been a $17 million NFL safety, the second highest paid player on the team. Or it'll be $17 million next year. I think it's like $14 this year. But regardless, he has not fully met expectations, and that's definitely reflected in this Bears fan survey. So overall, it's a sour tone, I think, from Bears fans on pretty much everything but Justin Fields. There were some good questions in there about, opinion on moving to Soldier Field, on which free agents will make the biggest impact, which late round rookies will make the biggest impact, and a lot of other ways to slice and dice it. Favorite historical Bear of all time, some fun names in on that list. Grading Bears chairman George McCaskey on how he handled the regime change. Public opinion on Matt Eberflus and his confidence, a little lower than I might have thought it to be as well. So go check out the full fan survey from The Athletic. Subscribe to The Athletic, man. They're worth every penny. Oh, they're like Kevin Fishbane over there and Adam Johns, like that group as a whole. Dan Pompei, my favorite writer in Chicago, without a doubt. But the group as a whole, consistently putting out some of the best Bears work you can get, and it's worth subscribing to The Athletic and supporting the work that they do there. I hope you'll also subscribe for free to the Locked On Bears podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, or on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel as well, to keep up with all of our daily Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, and hopefully every day. If you're looking for your second listen, the Locked On NFL podcast is going through the top 50 most valuable players on the betting line, the players that move the betting lines the most, whether they're in the game or not in the game. Justin Fields cracks the top 25. I talk about his position on that podcast this week, so go take a look at that as well and kind of see who's ahead of him and who he's ahead of, including some other quarterbacks that got some really big wide receivers this offseason, Fields is still the bigger needle mover among some of the other guys, some of his contemporaries at the position. So that's the Locked On NFL podcast, wherever you find your podcasts. In the meantime, I hope you'll come on back to Locked On Bears tomorrow. And as a result, I hope the podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.